What does being a Luddite actually mean?
Yeah, yeah, it's a big mischaracterization, and it's lasted decades and decades. So certainly, no one should feel bad about getting the term wrong. It's like the default now. But a Luddite is not anti-technology. The original Luddites were a lot of them were technologists themselves, right? They were technicians. They knew exactly how the technology of the day worked. They had their hands on it. They were hackers, you could even argue, in their day. But what they protested was the way that it was being used by bosses against them. So the way that it was being used to sort of exploit them or to degrade wages or specifically to take their jobs or to move their jobs into factories against their will. So a Luddite is somebody who protests an exploitative use of technology, often, very justifiably so.
Do you and I want to get? I mean, you've written an excellent history of the genesis of this and how what how that battle was waged at the time. I want to get into that, but do you think? And maybe I'm getting ahead of myself, but do you think that the reason that it was not a mistake that we misinterpret the term Luddite, that the sort of the class issue associated with it, the exploitation associated with it, had been drained from the popular understanding of what that word meant, and it just became some old fuddy-duddy who was just afraid to change his or her ways?
Yeah, no, 100%. You could even go as far as to say it was a propaganda effort by the crown and by sort of the elites of the day to very intentionally paint Luddites in this way. And the victors write the history books, so they, the crown sort of, and we'll talk about all this, I'm sure, but they raised troops, tens of thousands of troops. They occupied the districts where the Luddites were rebelling, and they put them down by force. And all this was accompanied by this sort of PR campaign where the crown was issuing proclamations saying, "Oh, these deluded men, they know not what they do. They're probably under the influence of some malign force." And, they were really painting them as backwards looking and dumb from the get-go. And if you think about, who that benefits, if you're somebody who might protest the way technology is being used to sort of slash your wages to profit somebody else, then yeah, it's really, really convenient to have a word in your pocket, to have a term in your pocket. Oh, he's just a Luddite, that you can write them off and dismiss those complaints, dismiss those real concerns with what's happening, and sort of dismiss them. And that's basically been the case ever since for 200 years. The elite class has had this very handy way of dismissing anybody who protests a potentially exploitative use of technology or a system of control that is being used against them, and they can trot out the term Luddite, and it's worked for decades and decades.
And so the story, your story, basically starts in the early 19th century, as we're starting to see these new technologies rolled out. At the time, obviously, these new technologies really had more to do with sort of the manufacture of textiles more than anything else. But set the stage for us.
Yeah, so you could kind of consider this to be the dawn of the Industrial Revolution. So we're not quite yet at the stage where you have the classic sort of portrait of the cities with choked with smog and just lined with factories. And we're sort of at the early stages where that is taking shape. So in the 1700s, you have a series of machines that are invented with the explicit purpose of sort of saving labor or doing the work that somebody might do, or at least automating it, as we would call it today. That term didn't exist then. They would call it mechanization. But things like the spinning jenny, the water frame, things that are producing yarn, things that are producing knit goods, things that are producing woven goods, things all to do with cloth production, basically. And then after sort of the laissez-faire movement, and Adam Smith comes along and kind of makes an explicit case for why you should divide labor, and into sort of a system that would become the factory system, a lot of entrepreneurs and sort of industrialists of the day sort of take this as a starting pistol, as a firing gun, to really start relentlessly kind of organizing work into a factory system, where before, for hundreds of years, you still had the machinery and you still were working with machinery, but you would do it in your home or in a workshop if you were a cloth worker. And cloth workers were the biggest industrial worker base of the entire nation. It was cloth workers, textile workers, and agricultural workers. That was pretty much the base of Britain's major workforce. And they were working in the domestic system, and you had a pretty decent life, right? So if you were working in the cottage at home, the term cottage industry comes from this period because it was pretty nice. You're working with your family. You can sing songs. You're working with your friends. You can take a break when you want to. You can stroll in your garden. You're not, at the whims of somebody else. So at the turn of the century we start to see an accelerated drive in the early 1800s. We start to see this push by entrepreneurs and sort of factory owners and people sort of interested in making a lot of money in kind of tearing up this old set of social contracts that used to govern life, used to sort of make a community tick, in favor of moving a bunch of jobs into one factory where they had control, where they could amass all these machines, some of which had kind of been around, some which were new, but the biggest thing was the way that they were being put to use. And that was to sort of automate this work. And instead of getting skilled workers, they would really try to get, child laborers or unskilled workers, migrant workers, vulnerable workers to sort of do the work. So you still needed people to run the machines, but it was a way to cut the cost of the labor by sort of getting somebody who wasn't skilled, who hadn't trained in the trade, who would churn out an inferior product, but you could make more of them. So yeah, the Luddites. Yeah, go ahead.
Well, before we get into Luddites, I'm just curious, how much of that so-called entrepreneurship was pressured is the wrong word, but fed by the growing sort of like slave trade in the U.S. and the increase in production in cotton that starts, around 1800, the late 1700s, through the next 5 or 6 decades, because you're going from something like, I can't remember, a couple 100,000, bales of cotton a year to like millions of bales a year over the course of those decades. So as that like sort of picking capacity comes, because we're getting more and more slaves in this country, the cotton gets picked, it gets financed from up north in this country, and then shipped for essentially, to be produced in Britain.
Yeah. So the two trends are just intensely and deeply related. They are happening at the same time, and in fact, I dedicate a chapter in the book to sort of the automation of the cotton production trade, and I call it one of the great sort of original sins of automation, and one of the greatest sort of technological unintended consequences in all of history, this side of the atomic bomb, probably, because when Eli Whitney was building the cotton gin, he at least outwardly was saying, when I build this device that's going to automate sort of the process of basically cleaning cotton and preparing it for export, that required a lot of slave labor. And he believed that, if we automate this process, then we can get rid of all those jobs, and it'll probably be a great boon to the project of abolishing slavery. So that's one reason you should back this up. This is not what happened at all, of course. Like, actually, at that point, when he's developing this machine, the institution of slavery was kind of at a vulnerable point. There was a strong abolition movement, and and sort of the case for relying on slavery was waning. But he invents this machine, starts trotting it out to the southern cotton producers, and what happens? It just blows up the demand for cotton, because now it can speed the process by which it's cleaned. So you need a lot more input, and all of a sudden it just the demand for more enslaved people explodes, because you have to have more people picking the cotton. So basically it gives slavery a new lease on life for another 50 years at that point. And the plantation owners are actually taking cues from the British factory system that had been imported first from England and then into the West Indies, and then we see it arrive in the United States, where they're really dividing labor in a much more intense way, and they have the overseers really ratchet up the amount of sort of contact that they have with the enslaved people, really driving them much harder. We see this transition to a system where it was still awful. The slavery was always awful, but the enslaved people were expected to sort of pick and produce cotton on their own terms. And then you see the gang system of slavery, where it's really sort of organized like a factory. And then this huge surplus of cotton then is exported back to England, where boom, they have a huge surplus of raw materials that now they need more people and more machinery to produce. So that in turn feeds sort of the rise of especially the Manchester cotton industry, where they have to sort of there's a big opportunity, quote unquote, to sort of produce more cotton goods. So they really start seeing mechanization ramp up there.
I'm just gonna. I wonder if we ever have seen an increase, an introduction of technology where it supposedly will eliminate certain bad elements, whatever, within the production chain. But in fact, what they always do, it seems to me, is just increase productivity in whatever is the easiest way possible. And that invariably means we keep that bad thing and maybe often like multiply it. I mean, we could see it from everything, faxes. When faxes were introduced, like, this is going to save, you time at work. But in fact, that time just ends up getting gobbled up. It always seems to be that dynamic.
Yep. Since day one, this is the story of automation. It promises the elimination of the human element, and it promises a streamlined, sleek sort of, production system that's going to be great, because we're going to eliminate these repetitive, dirty, dangerous jobs that people have to do, and it'll be great. We'll replace it. Almost never is that the case. There are always not only unintended consequences, but the employer or the boss who's instituting these. 9 times out of 10, this is being instituted by a company or a corporation whose primary drive is to maximize profits. So he's not going to let any of those productivity gains go back to the worker. He's going to capture them all himself. I mean, even John Maynard Keynes, like the most famous and influential economist of the last 100 years, he thought that the way that the trajectories were pointing of automation and technological productivity, he thought by the time the 21st century rolled around, that humans would be working a 10-hour work week, if they wanted to. Because he saw how productive machinery was, and he saw, just the potential there. But of course, that's not what happened. Of course, the owners captured all those gains, profited mightily off of them, and just ratcheted up the amount of work that most people had to do. This has been the case since the first factories made by the grandfather of the factory, Richard Arkwright, who I talk about in the book. I kind of call him the first tech titan. It's a loose term, but I think it works. And he was basically using children to produce yarn with his automated water frame. And instead of, lessening the burden on the previous population that was making yarn, it's this far more laborious and dangerous work regimen that's, because he just keeps ratcheting up the amount of productivity that he expects to see. And you can draw a clear line all the way through today with Amazon, with all of these productivity gains that they hope to get by having this intense sort of, it's almost this worker surveillance software where they kind of gamify the workplace, and you have to, they basically treat you, the worker, like a robot, where you have to hit X number of productivity goals and you get points for doing this or that, or you lose them if you take too long going to the bathroom. So there's always, new regimens that are promising to sort of, bring some great benefit through technology. And almost always, if the worker is not involved in the process of how that technology is developed or deployed, if they have no say in how it's actually going to be used in their workplaces and in their lives, then it will be used essentially against them, and they will have to fight to claw back those gains.